All right, I think we are now live. So good evening to everyone and welcome to another edition of the Justice in Pieces guest speaker series. Today's guest is Councillor Jennifer McKelvie, Ward 25, I hope I pronounced that right, Scarborough Rouge River. So thank you very much for joining us. Perhaps we could give us a bit of background of, how you got involved in politics and what's going on in Ward 25 right now.
Well, firstly, thank you very much, Professor Rodriguez, for the kind invitation to be here. I am the somewhat newly elected councillor for Scarborough Rouge Park, and I was elected in 2018. So I'm about 1.5 years into the job, best job ever. So very lucky to serve the residents of Scarborough Rouge Park. Just in terms of my background, before I crossed over into politics, I was an environmental scientist. And I was working in the nonprofit industry and really fostering industrial academic collaborations. And I know it seems like that's very distant than politics, but through my work, I was doing a lot of community engagement and going out into communities and talking to them about complex infrastructure projects. And I just found that I really enjoyed that communications part with the residents. And then I started doing a lot of that sort of volunteering in my own community with Rouge Park and different agencies. And so in 2018, I was really lucky that I made that passion my full-time job. And certainly I love engagements like this and look forward to all the questions that all the students have for me here today. In terms of my ward, it goes from the lake all the way up to Steeles, and from the Pickering boundary to about Morningside in the southern part and Nielsen in the northern part. And so my general work at the city, I try to really reflect my expertise and my background, because I think it's important that I focus on those areas where I am strong. So our priorities are Scarborough Transit, which I hope some of you will have something to ask about or say about later, investing in our ravines in the city, and doing great work to improve our response to climate change and to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions in the city. And so I'm very lucky that Mayor Tory, recognizing that was my background, he does give different files to different people. So I've been designated as the mayor's champion for environment and resilience in the city of Toronto. And I know you were interested, just to give you guys some background on what I'm doing then. The committees that I focus on are also focused on those issues and advancing those issues. So I'm the chair of Scarborough Community Council now, the vice chair of the Infrastructure and Environment Committee, and then I'm also on budget and TTC. And so through those, hopefully I can advance some of those initiatives.
Perfect. So how do you go from being an environmental sort of geoscientist and decide, I want to get involved in politics?
Well, I ran in 2014 and I lost, like many people on their first attempt. But I was undeterred and enjoyed it so much in the experience that after that, I started an organization called the Scarborough Community Renewal Organization with the Rotarians. So they had done a big assessment of reaching out to people and saying, what do you love about Scarborough? How can we make it better? And what can our role as citizens be in it? And then they decided to form that agency to start to implement those recommendations. So I was very lucky that they had liked what they had seen me do during the election campaign, even though I didn't win, and they asked me to head up that organization. So then what we did is the mayor was at one of our meetings and he said, okay, well, there's tons of ideas. Everybody's got ideas in Scarborough. Can you give me 3 big ideas that I can champion through my office? And so we had some consultations with the public and we came up with 3 big ideas that we put forward. So the first was to bring jobs to Scarborough, municipal jobs specifically, because when amalgamation happened, they brought a lot of the jobs in Scarborough downtown. And so if we have 25% of the population, we only had about 12% of the city's jobs. So how could we look at increasing that? So that was the first thing that we requested. The second was looking at how could we have a living arts center in Scarborough? Because, there's the North York Performing Arts Center. Mississauga has its own performing arts center, but like we have this great diversity in Scarborough. We could have a living arts center to showcase that, to have those sorts of cultural shows and exhibits. So that was the second ask. And then the third was looking at how we could have some jobs for Scarborough youth on infrastructure projects we're developing. So some of those community benefits and looking at having a trade school. So we had narrowed down to those 3 initiatives and put those forward to the mayor. And I'm still continuing to try to advance those initiatives, but it certainly gave me a lot of inspiration in 2018 to run again. And in that case, I wasn't supposed to be running against an incumbent. I signed up on the first day I could, on March 1st, super eager, after having waited 4 years. And then, of course, as you all know, about 2 months into that, there was the ward boundary change. And I did end up running against an incumbent, which I have a lot of respect for. Councillor Nathan Shannon, certainly neither of us had intended to run against each other. That was the change that happened provincially. And in 2018, unlike 2014, I was successful.
And that's an interesting point. I think perhaps we can show or tell the students the importance of getting out and voting, because I think you've been on both ends of pretty close. I think was within 600 votes the time you lost, and I think the time you won it was maybe even smaller than that. So how was that, counting down the votes and going through that on election night and getting the results? I mean, you have two polar opposite, probably a very difficult loss, and then a success the next time around. I mean, even that's motivation there to, if at first you don't succeed, try again, right? So what advice can you say from that experience?
Well, I mean, certainly I think what was important from 2014 is that even though I had lost, I still tried to do a lot of the things that I had said were important. And so I continued to volunteer on different organizations. I became the president of my local community association, as well as the Scarborough Renewal Organization. I was a citizen member on the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. So I had a lot of community involvement to advance some of the initiatives that I would have wanted to advance in 2014 anyway. So the big advice I always give anybody that's interested in getting into politics is to show your commitment and to wear it and to show it, right? So I showed it by doing work that I love as a volunteer. And then on March 1st, the very first day to sign up, I was there signing up to show my commitment to running in this election. And I think that's what shone through the second time, was that people appreciated that hard work and they saw that commitment and that resolve to continue to work for Scarborough.
So I have a question coming here from one of the students there, the first one on YouTube, and something that I shared with you as well that I was really a big, as a resident, really concerned about is about transit in Scarborough, right? And we've heard, I used to live in Scarborough as far back as 1988, and even as a child, I remember expanding the subway and getting it out to Malvern where I lived, and 30 years later we're still having these same discussions, LRT versus subway, 3 stops versus 1 stop or 2 stops, or what are your thoughts in terms of what's been going on? And in light of COVID-19, does that change sort of the discussion about maybe public transit is not as needed if we're looking at sort of what the new normal might be come to 2021?
So I'll hit the second part of that question first. I think that this pandemic actually shows us more than ever how important public transit is. Right now, we have an issue where the ridership is low. We know it will come back. But we also right now, we're still running transit at the same capacity because we know that the people that need to get to work to solve this pandemic, the people working in the front lines, that working in the hospital, they're the same people that are taking transit. So we've seen we can't shut down on transit during this pandemic. We can maybe only have about 30% of the same amount of people on a bus to account for physical distancing. So I think that this pandemic has really showed us that there is this important need to invest in transit. The other is that something that came out of the pandemic is that we look to advance more quickly the priority bus lanes across the city of Toronto. So there are 5 corridors where we are looking to change one of the lanes into a bus only lane. It's not curbed off, it's quick, it's nimble, it's paint on the road so that we can very quickly get people where they need to go faster. In my community, one of those is that Eglinton East corridor. So it will run from Kennedy Station up through Eglinton, along Morningside, and then along Kingston Road into the University of Toronto, Scarborough, and Centennial College. That corridor is one of the busiest in the city, transporting thousands of people both to the university, but also people that live in our priority neighborhoods. And what we've seen through COVID-19 is that the ridership is still the highest in those same corridors where those priority neighborhoods are. So we do need to continue to invest there. Now, that corridor is also the same corridor for the Eglinton East LRT. And we've all been clear that this is not a substitute for that higher order transit. We still need to work on the funding agreements. We still need to work on that project that used to be planned way when you lived back in Scarborough, whenever that was, yes, it's taken a very long time for the LRT, but we do have some good news and potential to advance that I will be advocating for. So one of the things that did come shortly after being elected was the transit upload of the subways from the City of Toronto to the province. And you can be for or against that or whatever merits you want. There's arguments on both sides. But one of the things that was interesting that came out of it is that the province said they will pay the City of Toronto's part of that program, which means that that's now freeing up money that we would have spent on the Scarborough subway. So it's fully a provincial project, also fully paid for by the province as well as the matching funds from the federal government. So in Scarborough and across Toronto, we've been contributing to the Scarborough subway levy. And so there's more than $800 million in funds that are accumulating. So what we need to do now is decide where do we move that money. So what you're going to see coming from me and from others in Scarborough is advocating strongly that that money was collected for Scarborough Transit and it should be spent on Scarborough Transit. So I'm very hopeful that that funding agreement we have with the province allows us to free up municipal monies to spend on the Eglinton East LRT. So this is a conversation that's going to be happening in the fall at council. You'll see through my social media and the work we do really ramping up to try to put the pressure on to make that argument, because I think what we can get is a strong win for Scarborough Transit through this new funding agreement that we have.
Now, a question that came up for Gary, Mr. Gary Ananandasengari, there in sort of the province, there was relating to green space. Now, what are your thoughts in terms of, especially with your environmental background, what are your thoughts on where there can be more space, parks in the Scarborough Rouge Park area?
So I'll speak firstly to my area specifically, but also through the whole city of Toronto, because that's one of the files that have been given to Champion. So in my community, we have a few big projects underway. So one of them is the extension of the Scarborough Waterfront Trail. So right now, there's a big piece that's missing between Bluffers Park and East Point Park. So that's a $170 million investment that we need to take. And what we'll have is we'll have a trail that runs fully along the Scarborough waterfront. And that's going to be an important corridor for active transportation and for leisure and recreation. But it will have, the ability to cycle across the entire Scarborough waterfront. So that environmental assessment has just taken place. We're now at a point where we're doing some finishing touches on detailed design, and we're advocating to both the provincial and the federal government for that funding. The other project that comes to my ward is the Meadowway, but this runs across about half of the city. So the Meadowway runs from the Don Valley River all the way out to Rouge Park along the hydro corridor. So that's 16 kilometers. And so one day in the future, those hydro corridors, the big towers that we have, those transformers that we have, they're all going to come down, because the way that we'll have an energy system in the future, we have this movement towards more localized energy sources, towards solar panels, towards on-site generation of electricity, but we're securing that space in perpetuity to be green space that's usable by the community. So there's a big investment that's happening there to build out, again, a bike trail, active transportation corridors, trails for walking, but also community gardens, and to bring out flowering plants that are good for butterflies. That's a big push that's through there as well, and for pollinators. So that's another initiative that's very important to my community. But across the city, writ large, we have the ravine strategy. So that is, the ravines are those north-south rivers that we have running. So Highland Creek, Mimico, Etobicoke Creek, the Don Valley, Highland, I think I might have said Highland Creek, but there's all these different creeks that run across the entire city, north-south. But what's missing for them is those east-west connections. And so by building those east-west connections, we're able to get these trails where you can use them as these active corridors to get about. So in Scarborough, you could think of the Meadowway, even though it's not a ravine itself, it's connecting across all those ravines so that you could travel up and down north-south, but then connect east-west, connect into them. So it's this green infrastructure that lets you get around. Through the west side of the city, they're going to develop a 60-kilometer trail that's a circle that connects all those ravines, and it'll be the ability to get out west from the Don Valley Brickyard and around. So that strategy is very exciting for both people, but also for the environment. So on the environmental side, what's important is that it's recognizing these green spaces where waters flow as that important green infrastructure that they are. So that infrastructure, it protects us from flooding. It gives us some erosion protection, slope stabilization. It sequesters carbon. It does all these different things that are good for the environment, which we call ecosystem services. And if you put a dollar value on our green space in the city, on these ravines, if you said, okay, if we didn't have these ravines, what is the amount of money we would have to pay for flood protection? What is the amount of money we'd have to pay for purifying waters to go through? And you calculated that up. It comes to $822 million annually. So it's a lot of money for green space. So that green space that's there has considerable value, and we need to protect that. And so through the ravine strategy, we're looking at going into these ravines to clean them up, because how many, I'm sure, I wish I could see hands. How many of you have gone into your green space and seen litter, right? Everybody's got their hand up. How many people have seen invasive species in our ravine system? Everybody puts their hand up. So these are important investments that we need to make, and they're going to have an enormous return on investment. So as I had mentioned, the mayor assigns out files. So the ravine strategy is one that I'm tasked with championing. And I've been trying to, every chance I get, speak to our provincial representatives and to our federal representatives. So I'm very glad that Gary and Ansangri brought that up, because he's listening to us and he's heard certainly myself and other Scarborough councillors say how important this ravine strategy is. And I think this is really a great moment for that investment, because we're looking at recovery from COVID. And I think we all agree that needs to have a recovery where we're more resilient and we're more protected in the future. And if you look at these ravines, during COVID-19, especially for the first few months, the only thing we could do was go for walks. It was the only thing that was allowed. The parks didn't shut down. You were allowed to use them for, walking, running, cycling. And I think what this pandemic showed us is that we need more green space. And so the ravine strategy and building out that trail network, it gives us and it secures more green space. A lot of green spaces that they have, things like, Central Park in New York, that was out of a recognition of the need for green space for public health and for some of the past pandemics that we've had. So I think that people are starting to embrace green space in a new way. They know how important it is. So I'm more hopeful than ever that we're going to get that investment from the other levels of government to really drive this program home.
Now, another question that came up related to that and other environmental issues with respect to climate change, and students wanting to know, what is the City of Toronto doing in terms of specific maybe initiatives or maybe more generally to respond to climate change?
So we have, I'm going to say, I do a lot of things in threes. So I'll tell you three key things that we're doing. So the first is Transform TO, and Arjun in my office is monitoring our Facebook. So I'm going to get him to pop up some websites for you guys too. So the first is Transform TO, and that's the city's plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And last November, we passed a resolution that we wanted to be net zero by 2050 or sooner. So what that means is that by 2050, we don't want to use fossil fuels or put any CO2 from fossil fuels into the atmosphere. And so now we're updating our plan so that we have those targets and we have that roadmap and that pathway forward. So that's going to come back, that plan will come back to council in the fall. So number one is Transform TO. The second thing we're doing is our resilience strategy. So that was released last year. And so the resilience strategy is broad, but I think a major component of it is addressing climate change. So the resilience strategy is how do we rebound from major perturbations? And it was initially developed thinking about climate change. So we know we're going to have hotter, wilder weather. And with that, that means we're going to have more blackouts. So we need to prepare backup generators in our buildings. We also know that it's going to be wetter, so we need to prepare for basement flooding. That's another thing that we need to look at. So we know the impacts, the strategy recognizes that the impacts of climate change are felt differently based on how and where you live in the city of Toronto. And so we need to make these investments so that we're more resilient to flooding, we're more resilient to blackouts, we're more resilient to heat alerts and prolonged heat alerts, because they're getting even longer and more often. But certainly, obviously, this pandemic, I think, has shown us that we also need to be resilient to a pandemic. And so a lot of those same principles are very much the same that we have forward, in making sure that our most socioeconomically disadvantaged are included in those strategies and included in those investments. So the resilience strategy is number 2. And then the third is something we just launched, and we're joining 16 other cities internationally. So that's Women for Climate. And so in Canada, Montreal and Vancouver are part of it. And Toronto has now joined. So we've put out a call. We've received applications. We're now narrowing it down to 12 women who will receive mentors that will help them to push their idea forward. And importantly, we're really trying to get a diverse set of applicants to the table. It's important that we focus on women because internationally, we know that women will be more impacted by climate change. And so because of that, we're forming this network, and it's a global network, right, of women that are coming together. And so in the city of Toronto, we're now looking to narrow down to those 12 women. We'll have networking, mentorships, and knowledge labs to help them improve their idea. And then they'll have a pitch competition, and the winner will receive some funding to help further develop their ideas and themselves. So I'm very excited. I'm reading the applications right now. I've sent in my scores. So many good ideas, very inspiring, makes me feel excited about the next generation of leaders. And I think that's what's important about this program, is that it's the women receiving mentorship are getting something out of it. But I think the mentors and the women participating, they're also getting reinvigorated and inspired by this next generation. So that would be the third initiative that I'd like you all to kind of know about, especially because it will be a reoccurring program. So it'll be important that you all start to share that with your network so that we can broaden the range of participants that are applying to the program.
So now we touched on it a bit with respect to COVID-19, and now again you're 2 years into your term, and you're thrown, or maybe like a year and a half, and you're thrown this COVID-19. How has that challenge been for you, and how have you got through it in terms of the connecting with your constituents, and how has City Hall been running during these times?
Right. So nobody thought they were signing up to be a politician during COVID-19. I had just hired a bright young policy and analyst that moved to Toronto from Ottawa right before COVID-19 started. So he was going to do committee work and briefs and preps and work on that kind of policy side of things. But then when the mayor was given emergency powers, council was suspended. So we weren't having committee meetings. I'm on 10 committees, so that's a lot of my time. We weren't having council, which is 200 pages of documents you need to read every month. So we had time on our hands, and I had resources, and I had people. And so we sat back and we said, okay, what can we do to help residents, and can we do to help people in Scarborough right now? So we've launched 2 initiatives that we focused our time on. So the first is about food security, and that was something very early on that I was worried about for a few reasons. So one, we know food banks are always stretched thin in the city of Toronto, but during COVID-19, we know that there's larger amounts of people that need to access it, but it's also a new group of people that are accessing it. So traditionally, the lowest of income, they know about the resource, they know where it is. We have our priority neighborhoods that we focus those resources on. But I was very worried about that group that has more the precarious work, or that work in the service industry and work in restaurants, and that were very quickly unemployed and may have never accessed a food bank before and needed to learn how to do that. So food banks were saying too that they had to shift their operations because they couldn't have people coming in, and they were switching to more of a delivery model, and all these different things were happening. So through that, the mayor had launched the Economic Recovery Task Force. And I was assigned the lead for the academic roundtables. So I had these calls with the representatives from all of our 8 big universities and colleges. And we had a guest speaker from Global Medic. And he said he wanted to launch this food packaging distribution food bank very quickly and was interested in space. And so what they normally do is Global Medic is an international humanitarian agency that goes into countries that have had earthquakes and disasters and war and need rapid deployment of help. And so they take large packages of food like rice and they package it in smaller amounts that can be distributed quickly and easily to people. And so it's very interesting that this international humanitarian organization was setting up an expanding shop in the city of Toronto, like not somewhere they would normally work. So on the call with me was the University of Toronto Scarborough. And as soon as the call was over, I was calling the chief administrative officer for the university at the same time he was calling me. And we were saying, we need to do this in Scarborough and we need help. So we brought this in as a partnership. So the University of Toronto gave the space. Global Medic, they donate the food and the equipment. I redeployed someone from my office to go and help full time because he was supposed to do policy work that wasn't happening. And so he worked for the last 3 months on that food packaging facility. The city of Toronto also redeployed some resources. So we packaged about 170,000 pounds of food that went out to 53 food banks for distribution. And it was just really beautiful to see that we had 3 Canada Summer Jobs students that were there. And in addition, we had volunteers, and we had volunteers that came from across the city and they were residents. We had students that were volunteers. So we had a really great way to bring community together to repackage this food and distribute it quickly to those that need it the most in those food banks. So that's one of the initiatives that we focused on. The other was, we had always thought there was a problem with the restaurants in Scarborough and the way the city promoted them. So Summerlicious and Winterlicious, you know, there was only 1 or 2 restaurants from Scarborough. And yet we all know how fantastic Scarborough food is and the wide range of diversity and cultural experience that you can get at these restaurants. But we're not really promoting them. So we had already been thinking about, you know, why is Summerlicious failing? Why is Winterlicious failing? And we thought, what can we do to help restaurants right now? So I had an intern I had also just hired. Again, the work is different. She normally would have done community events that happen on the weekends and booths and helping out with that. So I said, okay, well, what do we do with this resource? So she's been working and leading the Scarborough Restaurant Initiative that we launched. So again, collaboratively with the university, herself as well as students have called over 200 restaurants to let them know about the resources that the City of Toronto has and they can use. And now we are developing a website. It's called Find Dining, and it's being developed in collaboration with the students. And it's going to, importantly, it's going to say where the restaurants are and what they sell, but it's also going to tell that story of food, because I think that we forget there's people that are behind these restaurants, and these people all have a fascinating story about how they, you know, maybe came to the country, how they've maybe merged 2 different cuisines and foods. They might have a story of a recipe and where they got it, that it's a family heirloom, or the location of the restaurant itself. That could be the story, that it's this restaurant that's been around for, you know, many generations and transferred types and styles and people. So there's a food story that we wanted to tell. But in the meantime, we had to make sure that we were helping people immediately. So we were connecting them with Cafe Tio to help them set up their patios. And there was one restaurant, I'll just quickly tell you the story, Northern Smokes. The students had been working with them. He ended up on the front page of the Mirror because of the collaboration that he was doing. I went in to pick up some food, and it was just really great because he said, you know, thank you, because I was in the paper. I have 3 staff more today than I had this same day last week. So people were getting back to work and getting back to employment, which is what we want. So we're still continuing on that initiative. So I think COVID made us kind of rethink. We have people, they want to help, they have talents, they have strengths. How can we redeploy them effectively to help people right now? I'm still continuing to look for that. So if people have ideas on other initiatives and things that need to be championed, like, please do let us know. But I think it's important that we've adapted, just like community agencies have adapted. I think it's important that, you know, political staff adapt so that we're able to help people, you know, with this changing environment.
You just mentioned food there, and so I'm going to sort of put you there on the spot there. What are your, I mean, every Scarborough resident, I know for me, for example, Mono's Roti and Federic's and Mr. Jerk, I think, which is in your award there, are some of my favorites. But what are your favorite places? I know you have been posting on your social media about Takeout Wednesday, so maybe you can highlight some of those places, and maybe some of my Scarborough students here can pop in and try them out on your recommendation.
Yeah, okay, well, there's a few. So I will say my number one kind of hotspot is the Six Social. It has good food, but also has a pretty cool name. They have, they have a little bit of a twist and a fusion thing going on. So one of the things I like to have there with my kids is butter chicken poutine. So, I mean, that's a great combination. I have French Canadian family, and so my kids are familiar with that. And there's butter chicken, and they get to have the best of both worlds together. So that's something that I really like about that restaurant, is it kind of mixes a little bit. Northern Smokes is one that we've had with our neighbors. So if you're having a backyard barbecue, but you're like me and you don't actually know how to cook or barbecue and you want to look like you do, you just bring it in on a tray and here we go. So Northern Smokes is fantastic, and they have it's halal, but it's like Southern US barbecue. So that's kind of interesting as well. So it's this kind of unique combinations that we have of different cultures coming together to have really excellent food and just something different too. So I'd say those are two of the favorites. I'll give you guys a sneak preview. The next restaurant we're going to post for Takeout Wednesday is Scarlet Ibis. And it's Caribbean food, and one that I'm excited by because it used to be at Victoria Park, and now it's relocated out to my ward. So it's a Scarborough institution that I'm lucky is still a Scarborough institution and even closer to my house.
Perfect, thanks for that. So a couple more questions that came in here from the students related to stuff that we've talked about earlier. That you mentioned the extra funding perhaps that could be allocated in Scarborough for transit. Do you know any future plans with respect to the TTC and transit in general there, or what ideas or what vision do you have for future transit projects in Scarborough?
Well, I mean, I think it's getting these priority bus lanes done is the first step, and that Eglinton East LRT and that subway. So beyond that, the TTC is still looking at ridership very closely on some of our buses. So the Finch East corridor is considered for rapid bus lanes as well. Lawrence is being looked at, and so I think the good thing it's going to be interesting to watch this first bus lane come out because I think we don't have that in Toronto, but they do in Ottawa, and they work really well, and they do in Durham, and they have them in other places. But I think we need to really pilot this first one because that starts to open up people's minds on what's possible and how we get around and how the surface network gets around. We don't talk a lot about buses, but they're the workhorses of the city, and they are extremely important. So not enough respect, I guess, has been given to the bus. And, as a Scarborough resident, I spent a lot of time on the bus. So I understand why we're kind of over it and we're looking forward to the LRT and the subway, but I do think we have to reimagine the system. One of the things that is happening at TTC is the greening of the TTC as well and of the bus system. So not a lot of people know this, but we have North America's largest fleet of electric buses. And it's only 60. So you think, how can it be the largest? But really fully electric, carbon-free buses are a new innovation that's just starting to take off. So something that's interesting is the city has 20 from 3 different manufacturers, and we're looking at how they perform in the winter because that's an important consideration for us. And then we'll be able to know which one works best and which one to invest in more of. So we can work towards greening that fleet by 2050. But the last thing I think when you're thinking about the surface network, I want you to focus on or think about is micro transit. And coming to Ward 25 it's probably delayed because of COVID, but it's supposed to be late this year, is a fully automated electric shuttle. And that shuttle will go from the Rouge GO station up through the community to pick people up and bring them to the Rouge GO station. And that's great because it's that first kind of kilometer where people get stuck and it may be a long walk out to a bus stop, and how do we get them out of their houses into that either that first bus stop, or how do we get them to that transit node? So I'm really excited about this micro transit pilot. It'll only take about 10 passengers. It's small, it's electric, fully automated. There is somebody on board for passenger experience, and also I think during testing and comfort and talking to people, but they won't be driving it. So I think that's really exciting and something we hopefully, after piloting that project, piloting the electric buses, piloting the priority bus lanes, we'll start to see a little more respect for surface transit and some more investment in that.
And another question relating to climate change is, what are your views on renewable energy transition in the fight against climate change?
So we have a few cool things that are happening on renewable energy in the city of Toronto. So there is if you go through our social media in the back videos, we make some videos about cool things because we're trying to kind of share more broadly. So there's one about a paramedic station, and the paramedic station now has solar panels that are on it, and energy generator, battery generators, so that if there's a power out, they have power for a certain amount of time as well. So they have hugely cut down on their energy consumption there. And that was one of our first projects with that, and it's a retrofit on an existing building. But going forward, because we want to be net zero by 2050, Councillor Layton and myself brought forward a motion saying, well, shouldn't we start building net zero buildings now? So why are we going to build a building opening up next year that uses fossil fuels and will need to be retrofitted, which is extremely expensive? So there's Joyce Trimmer Community Center in my community will be hopefully shovels in the ground late this year, and it will be fully net zero. It will have a pool, a childcare center, and it will be off the grid. We also have out in Mount Dennis, the city's new first and largest net zero building. So that will be launching soon as well. And then also in my ward, the new University of Toronto Scarborough campus, residents will have a passive house technology. So it's about using, like the thermal heating and stuff, gradients from the ground and stuff. So there's some great projects that are being piloted across the city. We're not telling that story well because people don't know about it. So something we're also talking to city staff about is I'd like to see that we start to roll these into a bigger program that's something like Toronto City Lab. And there's a place where you have a website where you can see the different technologies. And so if you were at this building and it was a net zero building, it should have some sort of signage that lets you know this is part of this, pilot technology that we're doing, and somewhere where you can pull up that information. Because I think it's very hard to convince somebody to do technology on their home when they feel like it's not been fully checked, it's not been fully done. But if you see a solar panel on one of these buildings and you think, oh wow, that's not hideous, that's not terrible. Oh, and I just need it starts to give you this visualization, this confidence that you can roll that out for yourself. It also starts to put pressure on other agencies that are building right now to try to up their game to be competitive and to build net zero buildings. So I think we need to put more focus on telling that story. There are some great things that are happening, and then the more that also starts to bring the cost down too, when more people start buying into these technologies, and we get this greater buy-in. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but I'm more hopeful than ever about it.
Now, something that I think was just announced, maybe even while this was happening, a little bit more details, was rec programs returning in the fall. I think Mayor Tory made the announcements earlier today. I'm not sure what you may know about it, can tell us about it, but certainly people, especially in your ward there, wanting to have something to be able to do that we've lost over these last 6 months. So is there anything you can add kind of what's going to happen with respect to rec programs and maintaining proper social distancing?
So your news is as fresh as I have it. So I don't have too much more details on that. In our community specifically, and I think this is the case across a lot of places, we're also looking at conversations with our schools about space they need. And that's an important consideration because we know that some schools may be seeking space to have proper physical distancing for students. So we also, I think, want to keep that as part of this conversation to go forward. As you know, pools are open right now, indoor as well. We start to have some gyms that are open again as well. So I think we're all getting really missing each other as much as the physical activities. So I think it's an exciting announcement today, but more than the press release that you saw, that we haven't had the details yet in the implementation. So I'm looking forward to also seeing those.
What are your constituents? What have you noticed now with sort of more virtual interaction? I know you have an e-newsletter and things like that. What have you looked at in terms of engagement? And I think perhaps you have a unique perspective being fresh in the role of how do you think networking is going with you and your constituents, and what has this pandemic taught you about maybe thinking things differently?
Yeah, so Gary and Andisangri, our MP, was having some virtual meetings like this one. So I did that with him, and many of the different groups have organized them. So because if I was organizing a series, I'd always be just speaking to my same audience over and over and over again. I've tried to do more of this type, reaching out to other people's, and that way we're broadening reach. So then we have our e-newsletter that goes out weekly. And I will say, though, that since COVID started, we ramped it up so it's weekly. It used to be monthly. And we've had a much larger sign up daily to that newsletter, because I think people are looking for that information to come out. Obviously, social media has always been important, but again, I think we're seeing a lot more pickup on it than we used to see. So people are starting to look at the channels that we already had. In terms of new channels, we can't knock on doors and talk to people, but we have been trying to drop literature that points people to all those resources. So in our apartment buildings, we developed literature that tells them, where do you go for the resources that you need, especially during COVID. So, what is 311? What is 911? What does our office do? What are all these different resources that you can do? It had some social distancing information, and then some of the other buildings we dropped information about local food banks and resources for them. So we've been trying to tailor information that we're distributing to some of the local needs. And then certainly my newsletters have been tailored to what's coming into the office. So since COVID started, we have had a lot of emails about speeding. And I think that's because I don't know that people are necessarily speeding more, but I think people are at home sitting on their porch and working from home, and they're seeing this a lot more than they did. So we've had a lot of requests for, slow down signs, a lot of requests for those signs that you put up that monitor and tell people how fast you're going, watch your speed. And so there's been a lot of interest in measures to decrease speeding compared to what we'd seen over last summer, for example. And so we've been putting a lot of that information in our newsletter and what to do, how do you report this. The other is litter. And I think that's, again, people are in the parks. And so on the one hand, I think we have a lot more people using the parks. So it is possible there's some of the parties, some of the bonfires. But I also think a lot more people are in the parks all the time as well. So it's interesting that I think COVID's really kind of shown like that need again for those investments in the ravine strategy, in the litter, in the invasive species cleanup. And now we're starting to get buy-in for a lot of those programs because people are out and seeing it. Similarly, I think it's the active transportation lens, where people have a lot more renewed interest in cycling. And so we've brought out that active TO where we've blocked off roads and to try to slow traffic so that people can cycle on those roads more safely. And we've had a lot of interest in that coming in. So I think during COVID, we've really had to tailor our communications to what community is interested in. And there's been a huge shift over last summer in terms of what their interests are.
One of the questions here from one of my students here is about what sort of tax relief. Now I know obviously the city has its area that they can do, but what kind of relief measures and programs are specific maybe for students or residents in Toronto that you can highlight for them?
So there are relief programs for water, for hydro. It's all based on income. So the best thing to do is if you email our office, we can provide you with those resources. So the city has resources to help with, we were doing deferrals of property taxes, but we couldn't give forgiveness on it because we can't have a deficit based on the Provincial City of Toronto Act. So we do have those programs though to help with your bills. For your water and all those different programs. So we can share those with you. The other thing that's interesting, we put more money into it and it's not receiving the pickup or notice that I think it should. We have something called Rent Bank. And it's pretty much a low interest to no interest loan that helps people to pay their rent so that they don't get evicted and they're not pushed out of their properties. And it's a really interesting model because helping people with that loan, keeping them in their homes, in terms of like resources and the money spent, like if we had to move them out, move them into TCHC and get them in the backlog and then help them out and all that, those costs are much higher than doing this loan program where we can help people to stay in their homes. So the rent bank has received some more of that investment as well. So that's one that's there available for people to use also. I think those are the main ones, but I know Arjun in my office is on the chat and I know he's going to correct me because he answers these questions all the time. So he'll probably pop some of those resources in there for you, but those are the major big buckets and the biggest ones that we do to help. We're a little bit limited in what we can do being a city agency, but our offices all will help connect with provincial or federal resources as well. So certainly, I mean, the federal government's doing CERB and some of the bigger programs, but in that the city, we haven't created necessarily new programs in response to those things, but we are trying to make sure that they're more widely known or expanded, like the rent bank.
Now, another group of constituents in your ward are we gotta certainly thank them, our frontline health workers, right, the PSWs. And one of my students was asking maybe your thoughts on numbers as high as 1 to 13 residents, and especially with what's going on. Have you gotten any contact from any of these workers about some of the conditions they're going through, and maybe you could share any experience you have with that?
So I haven't, which I think is unfortunate because I think the experience for them has been extremely hard during COVID. So I will say that in my ward we have Sierra living, and it was one of the homes that the military was brought into because the COVID outbreak was so large. And actually, I should point out the artwork behind me was from students in the children in the community that was sent to us, and we sent copies to our long-term care facilities. So when we reached out to them to say, well, how can we help? They said, well, seniors are isolated and lonely and they're not allowed to have visitors. So that was one way that we tried to help. Now, there was a personal support worker that died from COVID-19 in that home, and the community was, very upset. They mobilized, they did some fundraising. They had a car parade to cheer workers up. The military came, they were embraced and people were bringing them food and lunches and meals and trying to support them as well. So the good thing coming out of this is that I think people have really recognized how much work is being done by personal support workers in our long-term care facilities. At council, I brought forward a motion and a request so that we write to the province to ask them to look very closely at that report that was brought forward from the military, and that they look at having a very broad investigation looking into this. So similar to after Walkerton happened, there was a very large tribunal, there was a very large investigation, and we had some excellent legislation that came forward with the Clean Water Act. I think we need a similar approach here. Just like with Walkerton, people have died. We need to have broad consultation. We need a very in-depth investigation, and we need to have some very solid recommendations on how we can make sure something like this doesn't happen again. And a lot of that is going to be looking at the role of the PSW and how we can support them. And that's an important conversation that we need to have. So we've expressed at the city, we extended our thanks to the military for coming in. We expressed our thanks to them for that report. And we've asked that the province really does a deep inquiry into this, just like they did after Walkerton, because this is something we need to prepare for the future. We need to be more resilient, and we need to support these wonderful people that have been taking care of our family members, that have been taking care of our community. So this is something where we all need to rally and come together around.
Now we've talked about some things you'd like to see in the future, and again, one of the things here with COVID-19 is we want to look past this and look at maybe what the new normal is going to be. And what would you like to see? I mean, we don't necessarily want to go back to the same old. So what would you like to see as part of the new normal? And what would you like to sort of champion? You're talking about championing stuff for Mayor Tory. What would you like to champion as part of this as we look to 2021 and beyond?
So through the roundtables that we did with the academic institutions, I was also part of several others, and I led one on the green recovery, and it brought together different community agencies and minds and thinking about it. And so I think when we think about recovery and reopening, I think it really has to have that lens of resilience, and that's a word I come back to over and over again during this pandemic. And so that is that investment in green space that has to happen. But I also think another one that came out of the academic roundtable and some other initiatives that I've been part of is access to affordable Wi-Fi. We have many people that, and especially students that are at home and didn't have access to Wi-Fi and that ability to switch to being online. And so there was this big gap and this huge inequity between children of different neighborhoods based on their economic status and their ability to access information during the pandemic. And so I think we need to look at, what happened, who was impacted most. Those are the same groups that are going to be most impacted during climate change, the same groups that will be most impacted during any other big future perturbation. And so I think we need to look at resilience very broadly as our ability to bounce back when something bad happens. And I think that's a big lesson learned for me during this. And that's something that I've heard as a theme through very different conversations with very different agencies. I think everybody wants that more resilient future, and it's the future we want that we need to build for.
Now, speaking of future, first of all, thank you very much for taking the time to join my students here today. Speaking of the future there again, what advice can you offer my students, getting through these times, studying through these times? Again, you mentioned the Wi-Fi, and certainly that pops up every once in a while, even on my end. But what advice can you offer them in getting through this and getting beyond COVID-19 and into their careers?
Well, I mean, I think it's just a reminder, like, we're all in this together, right? So we have each other. We need to count on each other. It's very hard. It's very isolating. Not seeing your friends, not seeing your family. But I think that the more we can find ways to stay connected, and I guess that's my advice is, find innovative ways to stay connected, to be creative. But I know you're all bright. I mean, it's just interesting. I more think, how are we going to look back on this time in 10 years, right? And how do we want to look back on this time in 10 years? I think we want to kind of look at it and say, we did the best we could. And I think we have. And I think we need to not be so hard on ourselves and recognize that this is a tough time. We're tough people, and we'll get through it because we have each other.
Perfect. So thank you very much once again. And I see that Arjun has posted how they can contact you on YouTube as well. So all the best in navigating Ward 25 during these times. And thanks so much for joining us and answering all of our questions.
Oh, thank you for the opportunity to be here. It was so much fun. I wish on YouTube, I can't see all the faces of the students that are watching, but do know that I'm continually inspired by the students that are continuing to work through this pandemic and learn. And thank you so much for that. And I look forward to what the future holds for you.
Perfect. All the best again.
Thank you.